You're good whenever you want to go then.
All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm Doug Westerfeld. I am the new Director of Area Planning for Decatur County. Welcome, everybody, here for the presentation this evening. I'm basically just going to hand it off at this point to Tamara, and she can introduce herself, and we'll get started.
Thanks, Doug. I'm going to try to be loud for the room, but not too loud for the streaming, because the mic goes to the streaming but doesn't work well in the room. So if you can't hear me, let me know, and I'll try to speak up a little bit more. My name is Tamara Ogle. I work for Purdue Extension Community Development. I'm a regional educator for community development. And some of the areas that I work in are land use and local government, which today means renewable energy. And so as I've worked in land use over the last several years, I've learned a lot about different uses as they've become things that communities have to make decisions about. So I do want to just note, you'll see this Indiana Renewable Energy Siting through Technical Engagement and Planning. We were awarded a grant from the Department of Energy last year to provide capacity building to communities to make better informed decisions around utility scale renewable energy. And so that includes, and I'll talk a little bit about the grant and how to connect at the end, but that includes educational workshops, it includes research, it includes a needs assessment that we'll be doing this spring to understand what local decision makers need, what information they feel like they need, or education or training they feel like they need in order to make good decisions, informed decisions. So what's good and bad can vary, but we want those decisions, we want people to feel like they're informed in the decisions that they're making and have all the things that they need. I noted this before, but that grant was awarded by the U.S. Department of Energy as well as Energy Works. And it's not just us that's working on this. So this was very much like DOE wanted to have state-based collaboratives, and so there's several organizations that are a part of this. So while some of the research is being done by us, some of it's being done by Ball State. APA Indiana is providing some webinars and some things specific for planners. And so there's a large group of organizations that are working on this. Next up, we are with the USDA, and so as part of getting funding from the USDA, we are an equal opportunity provider institution. And then finally, for our homework per se, if you are so inclined to take a quick demographic survey, that helps me to count for the grant how many people that we've reached. And so you can scan that QR code with your phone and take that survey if you feel so inclined. It is voluntary and anonymous, and all of that information is aggregated up when we share with stakeholders or funders. So been an extension, so this is just like the normal bit you have to go through. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about a few different things. Let me ask, how many of you serve on the Plan Commission or the BZA? Okay, a few? You guys raised those hands really low. I was like, I'm not even sure I'm catching all of them. So I've got about 3 sections of my presentation. The first one, I'm going to talk a little bit about renewable energy, both as a land use, but just what's happening with renewable energy right now and why are we seeing all of these proposals. I'm also going to talk a little bit about planning and zoning. And so for those of you that have sat on a plan commission for a long time, this might be old hat, but for those of you that are newer, we're going to go through what those different boards are and what they do, how that's set up here in Decatur County. Then we'll go into a little bit about renewable energy planning. And so how do we think about this land use in terms of our community's renewable energy plan, and that's any communities. What are those questions that we want to ask or discussions that we need to have around renewable energy planning? Finally, I'll tell you a little bit more about the grant and how you can get involved with other things that we're doing if that's something that interests you. So let's talk a little bit about renewable energy. Indiana is not the only state in the Midwest or across the country that's seen a surge of renewable energy interest. And some of that is driven by federal and state incentives, but it's also driven by market conditions. And so I'll show you in a little bit what I mean by that. The other thing that is different about renewable energy as a land use than some of the land uses we're used to seeing, especially in more rural areas, is these projects are very complex. And so it's, they're thinking about matching the energy availability to demand, right? You can't put on the grid what's going to, come off somewhere else. They're also having to meet a lot of regulatory and engineering requirements. And then you also have this piece of local community acceptance. And so there's a lot of different organizations or agencies that are in play as these projects are proposed and planned. So we do have a good source. This shows you wind and solar, but I'll focus on solar tonight. We do have a pretty normal consistent source of solar across Indiana. The very toe has a little bit higher, and so you can kind of see, oh, that's not a laser. Okay, well, if I had a laser, you can see the toe is a little bit darker of a yellow up there, and so a little bit higher of a resource. But as panels and that technology become more efficient and less costly, we've seen a lot of interest in solar in Indiana for that reason. And it's not really, it doesn't matter if you're in South Bend or if you're in Decatur County, we have about a similar resource of solar radiance. We also can't talk about renewable energy and not talk about energy in general in Indiana. And so Indiana is the 10th in total energy usage per capita. We also have used more electricity than we've produced since 2012. And in 2022, we imported about 13% of our electricity into the state. And so this varies from year to year. Some years it'll be higher because we've got a hotter summer, a colder winter, or other things that happen. Other years it might be a little bit lower. But since 2012, we've been importing electricity into our state, taking in or using more electricity than we're actually producing. In 2013, about 84% of our electricity generation was coal-fired. I'm probably way too close to that camera, aren't I? Oh, great. I just thought about that. And since then, we've had about 5,000 megawatts that have retired, and there's a lot more that is due to retire. And when we think about, it's possible with administration changes, we are in an energy transition. It is possible with administration changes in in state and federal government that speeds up or slows down, but it doesn't actually stop it. And so when we think about a lot of this electricity that's set to retire from coal generation, it's going to be your least profitable plants, right? Your companies are retiring the things that are the least profitable or need the most upgrade or would cost the most to upgrade. And so a lot of these things are set not only to retire because of federal mandates, but also because of market decisions. Renewable resources accounted for about 14% of our total electricity generation in 2023. Most of that is wind turbines. There's been some solar that's come in line that is included there. This shows a little bit about electricity demand and supply in Indiana. And so I mentioned this, I really wish I had a laser. It is there? It's a big button. Aha, that makes sense. So I mentioned that we have been importing more electricity, or we have to import electricity because we use more than we actually produce. And we have a state utility forecast group that assesses energy demands every year. And this is their projected growth in energy development out to 2040. I don't know, this was done in 2023. I don't know how many data centers are included in that. And as we see RFPs for data centers, sometimes they're using more electricity than that REMC's entire, the rest of their customers, right? So, we've got a lot of energy usage or electricity usage that is growing in the future. These are our existing resources. And so I mentioned that we have coal plants retiring, and then what this leaves is this gap. And so this is one of the things that is driving that renewable energy production, or any sort of energy production. If you would have asked me if would be working on nuclear 10 years ago, I would have said, what? But here we are, we've done nuclear feasibility studies, we've talked about all sorts of different things because there's people that are curious, how are we going to fill this gap? I mentioned earlier that the market drives a lot of this. These are the levelized cost of energy comparison. So if you take what it would take to put in a new generation today, nuclear, gas peaking, coal, geothermal, gas combined cycle, solar, or wind, and you divide that cost across its entire lifetime, solar and wind are the cheapest options, and that's without subsidies. So that's one of the things why we have developers asking, is because they are looking to make money, right? They are in the business to make money, and they're going to move towards technology. The market's going to move towards technology that is cheaper versus more expensive. We also want to see this in terms of affordability for customers, right? And so you'll hear sometimes about IURC and rate increases, and you'll notice something happening in the legislature right now around nuclear and whether those upfront costs can be passed on to consumers. And so there's a bill right now discussing that, and that's one of the concerns about nuclear as we look at it, is it does have a very high cost. Now we expect that technology, as it becomes less new, to go down, the cost to go down. You can see what happened with solar from 2009 to 2024. But that's what's going on in the energy market. So thinking about that levelized cost, what's the cost in the long run? Things that require fuel that's not free, so solar and wind, the fuel is free, not the infrastructure, but the fuel itself is free. So things that take fuel are going to be more expensive, and things that take a lot of labor are going to be more expensive. Anybody in here run or own a business? How much of your cost is labor? Significant? Okay. So as we think about just rationally, what tends to be more expensive, it's things that take labor and things where you're paying more for the fuel. Just some solar cost trends. And so why do we have large utility scale projects versus smaller scale proposed? And this really has to do with economies of scale. This study, utility scale solar, found that these larger projects are 13% less, that cost 13% less per megawatt than smaller projects. Same way with residential rooftop. So when we're looking at rooftop, Lazard does some great projections. They're the ones that did the levelized cost projections. It's about 3 to 12 times higher to install rooftop PV, and we don't have net metering in this state. So there's not nearly that. It's a much longer payback period for the homeowner. And then the last thing is, you'll notice a lot of the solar systems that are coming online track. And so that means that as the sun moves, they tilt towards the sun. That tracking actually increases energy production by 15 to 20%. So again, lowering that levelized cost because you're producing more electricity with approximately the same equipment. The other thing that I want to mention, and I mentioned how complex it is to get energy generation projects built. There's a lot of different things that have to happen. And one thing that we don't talk a lot about is the independent service operators. And so we haven't always had an independent service operator. My father was on the REMC board, has been, I think, all my life. So probably 40 years now. And he talked about a time before we had MISO, right? Before we had this independent service operator. And basically our system to make sure we didn't overload the grid was just all of these utilities and REMCs trying to talk with each other and make sure that they're not burning out our grid and putting too much on, right? And so I think it was 2005 that we created this independent service operator. Most of us are under MISO. There's a little section of Indiana that has PJM, but we are connected. Unlike ERCOT down in Texas, does anybody remember what happened in Texas a few years ago in winter? Okay, so ERCOT's not connected to anybody else, which means that when their natural gas went down because it was too cold and they weren't prepared for that, there's no one that can send them electricity, or it was very difficult. We are connected to PJM. We're also connected to this whole MISO region. And so those electrons that are being produced are going to that first sink. But when there's a natural disaster somewhere, when there's something happening, there is communication between these two different independent service operators. The independent service operator, they schedule generation, they schedule transmission, so they're going to have to approve everything that gets built, and reserves. They do all that planning for the grid system, and they manage the system in real time, right? Like if you're a utility, you're getting an email every morning about what's expected in terms of electricity needs, whether you're gonna have to turn off generation and so forth. It is a nonprofit organization, and it is regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So not the full scope of how energy or how electricity works in the United States, but I think it's important to understand some of the things that, that happen behind the scenes. The other thing that I mentioned was demand and capacity early on, and what that makes these projects complex. And so you also have to have interconnection available. So a lot of times when a developer is looking at creating new generation, they're asking about transmission lines. You know, they're looking at where those transmission lines are. They are also thinking about, so those transmission lines may be full. So I know we had a wind project proposed around my house, kind of, and there's a transmission line that runs, it's about a half mile north of me, and I'm like, oh, that makes sense. They're gonna put it on those transmission lines. And when I got to looking at the project, they can't put anything on those transmission lines. They're already at capacity. They were gonna have to build a new transmission line into Kokomo that's close by. And so this really, that upgrade cost, that cost of upgrading the transmission or upgrading a substation really plays into whether a development gets built or not. It's also something that we don't think about. Their transmission lines are not publicly owned. So it's not a public good. But it's also something that we use every day. And it's important for our community from an economic development standpoint to have availability on those transmission lines. So just keep that in mind as we think about, you know, are my kids gonna be able to build a house here and be able to run electricity to it? Are we going to be able to feed the needs of businesses that we already have that are expanding? Are we gonna be able to recruit new businesses? One of the things that they need is electricity, and so having extra capacity on your transmission line is a good thing for growth. Here's a little bit of a timeline for utility scale solar, and I think some people would tell you it's even longer than this, but I just want to point out that there's a lot that's going on. So sometimes in communities, we hear about a solar development or we hear about a wind development, and then it goes quiet, and the community doesn't understand when it comes back and it's moved forward some, right? And so this is what's happening behind the scenes, is there's this prospecting phase where the developer has to make sure that there's land, right? There has to be willing landowners. If there's not willing landowners, they don't have a project, right? And so that's the first thing that they're going to look for. They're also gonna have to do some preliminary site designs, some site permitting, and a power purchase agreement. They have to have that power purchase agreement. So who's going to buy that power before they ever enter the queue on the independent service operator? So before they ever submit to MISO, all of those things have to be in line. They've also got to obtain financing. And so we don't get to the land use local permitting until towards the end, right? To where we're almost to construction. And part of that, if you look at your ordinance, is you require all of these things ahead of time, right? You need them to have a set site plan so that you can make a decision on that. And so I just point this out, that this is a very long process. And we've had issues, independent service operators have seen really big backlogs at times. There's been times where they've put a pause on accepting new developments into the queue, and they've kind of updated that to where you have to have your power purchase agreement before you can enter the queue. But there's times that this has been even longer. So what are developers looking at? So one thing is transmission capacity and reasonable upgrade costs. So if they've got landowners interested, but they can't swing that development financially because of the upgrade costs or because there's no transmission capacity, then it doesn't matter, right? Market zones where a project can be financeable, marketable, and competitive, right? They have to have that power purchase agreement before they can enter the queue. No other disqualifying impacts, right? So I talked about the wind turbines, the wind farm that was proposed around me. One of the issues was we are in Grissom's flight path, right? And so they could put towers north of me, they could put towers south of me, they couldn't put towers right along that flight path, like they had to stay a set distance away from it. And so that's another thing that they're looking at that changed the shape of the project, the proposed project as they move forward. Good solar and wind resource, and then a predictable or amenable policy environment. So in general, you are going to have regulations for a development that's this large that they have to follow. That's not a problem. It's not having no regulations at all. But is that consistent? Are decisions made in a consistent way? Or are we going to get ourselves into a issue of lawsuits, right? And try to stay out of court is, I think, what most developers would tell you. So, does anybody have any questions about energy in general or electricity in general before I move forward with planning? Okay, have I bored you all to death? Well, that's good. I did not, I came into this sitting on a plan commission in Cass County, and at the time it was right after the housing bubble. We had zero development. We did a lot of unsafe houses. We did a lot of, we did have the Hoosier Heartland coming through, and so we got to do some really cool things with an overlay district along the Hoosier Heartland and some long-term planning. When I came to this more specialized position, what really got me into ordinances was confined feeding operations. That was the big thing right then. I was an ag educator. I was also had a land use background, and so those two things, I was like, yeah, I can talk about ordinances. I can inventory these. And then it wasn't very long after doing confined feeding operations that I begged. I was like, please, somebody let me do wind and solar. And it was so early on that I just had to wait until the market crept up. But I knew from going out for CFOs that people were asking, what do we do about wind? What do we do about solar? And I was like, I feel like this is something that is going to be a big deal in the future. Not me, that's good. So I come at this from that angle, and with any land use, and you'll hear me say this as we get into renewable energy planning, a planner doesn't look at a land use as being bad or good. We look at it as, what does it mean for the community? How does it conflict or support our comprehensive plan? How does it conflict with neighboring, or what kind of land use conflict or incompatible uses there might be, and how can we mitigate that? And so that's really where I come at land use planning from. So the next thing I want to talk about is the role of the planning in communities. I know a few of you raised your hands that you were either Plan Commission members or BZA. How many of you would really love to serve on your Plan Commission or BZA? My gosh, so much fun. Maybe not BZA, Plan Commission, yes. BZA, I'm not so sure about sometimes. But we're going to talk a little bit about this. So if you are wanting to serve or you are going to those meetings, interacting with planning staff, it gives you a little bit better idea. If you are on those, then this is really stuff that you should know. And you know, how we're making, what our role is, what our responsibilities are, how we're making decisions. So in community planning, we are always having to balance private property rights, which is a core tenet of democracy, with regulating uses for the health, safety, and general welfare of our community. That's the police power that gives us the ability to plan, and we're constantly having to strike that balance between not cutting too much into private property rights, but also protecting our community in terms of welfare, health, and safety. This map up here shows you the different types of plan commissions. We have two main types of plan commissions in Indiana. Unfortunately, they both have the acronym of APC, which leads to a lot of confusion with the plan commission. But in Decatur County, you can see right here, you guys pick out your county from the slant. Is that how you see your county on a, okay. I look for Carroll because it has White and Cass kind of come over it halfway, and they're like hugging Carroll County. So Decatur County is an area plan commission. That's really important to understand, both if you're bringing something to the plan commission or if you're on that plan commission or BZA making decisions, because there are different laws for area and advisory. They operate differently. So very important to keep those two straight. That is why I will never use the acronym APC, because people don't know whether you're talking about area or you're talking about advisory. Area plan commission, so that's the only one I'm going to talk about today because that's what you are. They plan for a county and at least one municipality within that county. So what's your other municipality that you plan for? Westport, Millhausen, so you got two? 4? Okay, but you know what they are. And not Greensburg. Greensburg has their own, which is fine. You can have a plan commission that serves the unincorporated area and some of the municipalities. The other municipality can still set up their own advisory plan commission if they don't want to join the area plan. They give up their extrajudicial territory, or their fringe as we call it. So if that's something that you're curious about, I can talk a little bit more about that. Generally, with an area plan, you have unified plans and ordinances for that area plan commission. They do have to be, so remember, the plan commission is mostly an advisory group. It's not an advisory plan commission, it's an area plan commission that gives recommendations or gives advice to the legislative body. In terms of adopting plans and ordinances, that is the job of the legislative body. So the county commissioners, also the town council or city council, depending on your municipality type, those are the legislative bodies that have to approve those ordinances and the comp plan. Cities or towns that are, okay, I mentioned that. And then the membership for Area Plan Commission is screwy because it depends on the towns that you have involved, how big those towns are. But I just shared here the code. So if you want to check that out, I know you guys have kind of been through that as you've coming into a new year and making new appointments to the Plan Commission, but just making sure that when we're making decisions as a Plan Commission or as a BZA, that we have properly appointed the correct people, because any of those decisions that we make that are when we are not operating in according to state code can be a problem later on. So what do the Plan Commission and BZA do? The Plan Commission prepares the comprehensive plan. They make recommendations on zoning, subdivision control ordinances, and any amendments to those to the legislative bodies. They do approve, there's a couple of things that they do have final say on. They approve development plans and subdivisions. And I'm not talking about like cookie cutter houses, but actual subdivisions of parcels. And they also manage enforcement. Oftentimes staff takes on a lot of that management of enforcement, but that is listed under the Plan Commission. The Board of Zoning Appeals is a quasi-judicial board. And so that's why you ever hear of findings of fact. That's why they fill out the findings of fact afterwards, right? That if a decision was to get appealed, that's going to go straight into that case, right? Like that findings of fact is very important. Because of the type of board it is, because it's quasi-judicial, it's not your main planning board. So they're supposed to be making decisions that interpret what the legislative body and plan commission have done. That is all the BZA is supposed to do. They're interpreting that and taking on special issues. And so what they do rule on is variances from development standards, special exceptions. Do call them special exceptions here, right? Double checking. And they hear appeals of staff administrative positions. So if somebody doesn't like what Doug, thank you. I don't know why I want to call you Greg. I feel so bad. What Doug decided, they could appeal that to the BZA. And so what the BZA is not doing is, it's a lot like an executive branch. We can't go in as a BZA and say, no, this is what the law should be. That's done through the Plan Commission into the legislative branches, but they're simply interpreting those case-by-case issues where we have a variance that's requested or we have a special exception. Like I said again, and I say this over and over again, the legislative body is the one that does that final adoption. So on everything except for hearing appeals, because they're not quasi-judicial, or development plans and subdivisions, it goes to the legislative body, and that's important because they're elected. Okay, what are the important documents? I should have asked this before I turned. What are the important documents for planning? This is like a memory game now. Your ordinance, which one? The zone. Okay, the zoning ordinance. You also mentioned the county, the general ordinance empowers you to act as a plan commission. What else? Debbie, you can't answer all of them. How long have you been in the office? We know you know.
You know.
What else? Are you telling me none of you have read your comprehensive plan? Love how honest that was. You know what? And that's probably true of 99% of the people that live in this county or across Indiana, right? But when we think about those important documents, it's really that comprehensive plan. That should be governing everything we do. And so when we update a comprehensive plan or we have a new comprehensive plan, it's really important that we have those focus groups, that we are really getting out into the community to make sure that we're creating a plan that the community has had input on. The zoning ordinance, the subdivision control ordinance, and the last one is the rules and procedures. So this is really important. There's things that we often don't put into the zoning ordinance because they have to do with how we hold public hearings and how we when we meet. Do we meet on the third Thursday of every month at 9 a.m. or whatever that might be? We don't want to put those things in a zoning ordinance that's more difficult to change. Those things go in that rules and procedures, but we have to follow our rules and procedures when making decisions. And that's your comprehensive plan. So if you do feel like you need to fall asleep later, it's 168 pages, I think. So it's some light reading. I did read quite a bit of it though. So a citizen planner's toolbook, or toolbox, toolkit, whatever you want to call it. What should you have if you are a citizen planner? So the first thing that I have in my bag all the time is the Indiana Planning and Zoning Laws Annotated. This is because I don't like to use the state website and look up code. It's really hard and it's hard to read. And it also gives you some case law. This is called the Blue Book. It comes out from APA and the Land Use and Zoning section of the Indiana State Bar. Every once in a while when things are getting updated. I don't know how many times I've sat in a meeting and somebody's asked me a question. I don't know everything, but I do know how to use an index and look it up. And so if you're on a plan commission or BZA, it's something that I highly recommend to have. Your comp plan. if you're on the BZA or you're on the Plan Commission, you should have read this cover to cover, right? This is how we're making decisions, is from that comp plan. And there's going to be things in the comp plan, we'll talk about this in a little bit, that contradict each other. And that's part of planning, is figuring out how to make things work when there are contradictions in real life. And then your zoning ordinance. So I printed out just the solar energy facilities, but keeping that in your binder and bringing to every meeting, I think, is a great thing. If you are a low paper person, you can use your computer. I don't like reading off of a computer, and I find that people that say that they're going to read off the computer don't actually do it. So I always suggest just print them out. It's a lot easier to be able to flip through the pages. And then I suggest having the Citizen Planner's Guide. So this is something that APA puts out. I just printed, so I do look at this one on the computer usually. I just printed today the Board of Zoning Appeals Basics. That's chapter 2. The first chapter is Plan Commission Basics. But when there's something I'm not sure about and I'm not sure where to find it in the Indiana Code, a lot of times I'll look in here first because it's a little bit more user-friendly. It lists the code. It gives some explanation around it. And then if I need to, I can go to the code as well. So being a citizen planner, to me, is a really serious thing. Your community is putting a lot of responsibility on you, and oftentimes nobody wants the job, but it is an important job for communities. And as I drive around the state, sometimes I look at examples of really poor planning or where planning didn't happen. And I see areas where really good planning really helped a community. And so just keeping that in mind, it is an important responsibility. With that, I always suggest training. We do have a training course that is online that has a certification with it. I think this is great if you're going to be serving very long, or if it's something that you're really just interested in. They also do some land use basics or Plan Commission basics from APA and the Land Use Consortium. That's also an excellent workshop to get started. So, ready to talk about renewable energy planning, or does anybody have any questions about planning in general? Yeah, so what happens is you can... So one of the things that we do with this is it is online, and it's also, we have a couple that we do in person. Sometimes we can do those through Zoom, but sometimes we've had like an entire Plan Commission go through together, and we've done that in the local community. With that, I think Dan Walker's in charge of this. I think Dan will also come out and do short workshops if needed. We don't want to take what APA already does with like their workshop, but if there's something that a community needs, he can do a workshop.
You said you work with folks from Purdue. There are some counties where they use a point system.
Yeah.
Is that anything that's been transferred over to solar or wind or anything?
Yeah, I don't know that I've seen that going forward, or I don't know that I've seen that in renewable energy. I'm trying to think if. Oh, I'm so sorry. The question was, for CFOs, confined feeding operations, there are some counties that use a point system. So you have to hit so many points to be allowed. And the question was, have I seen that for renewable energy at all? I haven't. I've seen, I want to say that I've seen things in a county or two where they'll let them bypass part of the process if they are doing pollinator friendly or if they're doing some specific things, but I don't think I've seen it like a straight up point system. Yeah, so the comment was just that this person has taken APC or the American Citizen Planner, don't know if I'm using Indiana course, and how helpful it was. And a lot of times the people that participate are not necessarily on plan commissions, but are interested in land use policy. I had one other back here. Oh, hold on a second.
Are members of the Area Plan Commission and BZA required to take this online training?
No. So your Purdue Extension educator is required in the first 2 years, but that's an employer requirement. But no, Indiana does not like putting in place education requirements for elected positions or appointed positions. There's very few government positions that require any sort of education. Assessor would be one of the big ones. But highly encourage it, even if it's not required. Okay, let's talk a little bit about renewable energy planning. I'll also go into a little bit deeper special exceptions, since that's how solar is permitted here. So this is the renewable energy inventory. We did this back in 2021, 2022. I read every zoning ordinance in the state for renewable energy, and we inventoried those and made county snapshots. I went back a year later and did another report after the state had passed their voluntary standards to compare, and we had already had 14 changes, new ordinances or changes to other ordinances. And so this got out of date very quickly, which is a little unusual in land use for it to get out of date that quickly. But with that, we'll be updating it as part of the R-STEP project this year. I've already written my survey and methodology, and it's something that I know a lot of communities use, so we'll update that. It does give you an idea of what communities have done, or at least what they were doing a couple of years ago. So when I think about planning for renewable energy or any type of land use, it doesn't matter if this is solar, it doesn't matter if this is multifamily residential. But what I'm gonna think about first is a comprehensive plan, goals, and objectives. So what goals will these developments support, and what goals will they conflict with? Like I mentioned, there are going to be contradictions within a community, within real life, within a comprehensive plan. And so there will be goals for every single land use that land use supports, and there will be goals for nearly every single land use that it conflicts with. Next up, conflicting land uses. So we're always trying to reduce land use conflict. So when we have one use or two uses together, sometimes we've got noise or odor or something that crosses property lines. So we're trying to reduce that land use conflict. And so one of the questions that we would ask with solar is, what are the primary concerns or issues? So what are our concerns that might conflict with an adjacent or close by land use? And what tools or standards, because we're trying to protect private property rights, so our first question is not yes or no, but our first question is, are there tools, or what tools and standards would help to alleviate those conflicts? So we're always going to have conflicts between land uses. Our first step before we disallow something is to think about, is there ways to mitigate or lessen these conflicts? The next one is public infrastructure and investment. And so how do these developments add to public infrastructure and investment? So I mentioned it's awfully nice to have extra capacity on the transmission lines serving your community. That would be one way that it would add to public infrastructure and investment. What measures need to be put in place to protect or remediate public infrastructure? Construction of something like this is awfully hard on your roads. And so that might be a concern that we have. Are there ways of remediating that? And then externalities. What are the positive or negative externalities of these developments? Sometimes we think about jobs. Sometimes we think about housing, like if this is a multifamily residential and we're having a real crunch for housing, or we're having dropping enrollment in our school, having extra housing is a positive externality to the community. Sometimes there's negative externalities. So with one single family residences, a lot of times what comes up is, do we have capacity to serve them, right? Another thing with externalities would be things that cross property lines, right? And so having something might create more traffic, or it might have an odor, or it might have a noise that crosses property lines and affects our community in general. So land uses can be permitted in a zoning district. So we do this by zoning district, by right. And so if that's the case, you're just going to fill out your improvement location permit, submit that to the office. They'll look at your site plan to make sure you're following the zoning district standards, and it's approved. By right with additional use standards. So you've got to follow your zoning district standards, and there's additional standards for that specific use. By special exception, and so that can have additional use standards with it still, but special exception's different. It's going to go through the BZA, or it can be not permitted for that zoning district. If something's not permitted in a specific zoning district, it might be that we're pushing it to another zoning district, right? And so we think about, you know, commercial, like a Target or whatever. Probably not going to include that in an agricultural area. We've got issues with traffic, parking. Are those roads going to be able to handle that? Is that really the vision or the purpose of that zoning district? So we may not permit that in an ag area. They can still build in that area. What they have to do is ask for an amendment to the zoning map, which is also called a rezoning. So one of the things between CFOs and renewable energy, I was working a lot on farmland preservation. And so we talked a lot about what can we do in our zoning ordinance for farmland preservation. And the thing is, we can set up a lot of cool things, but at the end of the day, zoning ordinances can change. So, and your zoning district can change. So a special exception, and this comes straight from Decatur County, is what Decatur County uses in their ordinance. They are permitted in Ag 1 and 2 zones, Business 1, 2, and 3 zones, and Industrial 1, 2, and 3 zones by special exception. That has to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals, like we talked about earlier. And there are some additional use standards along with that, and I'll talk about those in a second. So for a special exception, this is a property that may be allowed under specific conditions. So a lot of times we have a special exception in a specific district for that use. If we feel like it's something that we want to look at the site plan, we want to be able to work with that applicant on how that's gonna work and how it'll be reduce the most conflict or externalities, negative externalities of that land use. So it's really intended for site-specific review, which is why it goes to the BZA. There are other communities that use an overlay district to do this instead of the BZA, and it goes to the Plan Commission. The thought with that for renewable energy is this is a large swath of land. And so those larger decisions or larger swaths of lands maybe should be made by a Plan Commission where their predominant role is planning. BZAs are very site and permit specific. But it depends on the community, it depends on what they want to do. So there's two kind of different ways to have this level of review, either overlay district development plan through the Plan Commission or a special exception through the BZA. The BZA rules, and it still has to meet all the district standards, all the use standards, unless they're also asking for a variance. They can do that. The BZA also in this process can impose reasonable conditions, and so this is that opportunity to work with the person that is seeking the permit to say, okay, this is okay, but really we'd like to see this too. They also can require written commitments. So these are the use standards, so the things that a solar energy facility would have to follow in Decatur County. So these are the plans that are required. Pretty much everything you do is going to require a site plan, a written statement with illustrations, which I'm not sure how that's different than a site plan, but maybe you know. A road use agreement with the Decatur County Highway. So some of this is checking off to make sure that that permittee or the person seeking the permit has checked in with all of the appropriate people in the county. Engineer stamped drainage plan, and so they'll have to go to the surveyor for that. Visual impact analysis, facility maintenance and removal agreement, and a certificate of insurance and indemnification. So when we look at kind of those actual standards, or construction standards, I think is the term that you guys use in your ordinance. There's a fencing standard, so fences have to be at least 8 feet tall. They cannot cast a shadow on surrounding properties. You have to have an approved cover crop or ground cover. Safety and emergency signage, neutral color for all accessory uses. It cannot interfere with communication signals. It follows the zoning district setbacks, which it would have had to follow anyway, even if that's not in the ordinance. And then the noise limit of 50 decibels at ground level to the property lines or at the nearest resident. Sometimes I have to think about when that's redundant or not, but so a noise limit. And then finally, you do have a little bit on decommissioning. You noticed in plans it said removal plan. That's probably the decommissioning plan, just a different term for it. There's a time limit for the removal, and the land has to be restored to a minimum of 5 feet below grade. A decommissioning bond is required. So one of the things when that special exception comes to the BZA, try to watch my time so I'm not going too late. When that special exception goes to the BZA, Indiana code doesn't set criteria for the BZA to make a decision on. They do for variances, but they don't for special exceptions. And you'll notice if you go to another county, this might be called a special exception, it might be called a conditional use, it might be a special use. We don't do a great job in planning across Indiana of having similar language or sometimes similar ways of doing things. Sometimes special criteria is confused with that variance criteria set by the state. So when we did our first survey for the ordinance inventory, everyone that responded to me, or nearly everyone that responded to me when I asked what set of criteria they used for special exceptions, listed what was in the state code for variances. And you'll see in a while that doesn't quite work, but it is something that commonly happens. Communities can have a set of general criteria for considering special exceptions, and we'll talk about an example here in a moment. You can also set use-specific criteria, and so when I was in Cass County, we had some use-specific criteria for CFOs because they were a special exception in that county. And then the criteria really is important because it should be used in that findings of fact. So there's worksheets, like if you're doing a variance. And do you guys use a worksheet for variances for your findings of fact? Okay. So this is just a sample of a variance worksheet. It lists out all those different criteria that are required by the state for a variance, not a special exception. And then as the BZA is listening to that, they should be making notes and deciding whether that criteria is met or not. They're going to bring that all together at the end when they vote, and you'll have one findings of fact for the board, is I'm guessing how you do it, although there's a lot of different ways of people doing it. So that may not be exactly the same way you do it. So when we have criteria for special exceptions, that can be that same type of worksheet. It can help us to walk through that criteria and make sure that we're making a decision based on the criteria that's been set by our plan. These are the development standards variance criteria. So the approval will not be injurious to public health, safety, morals, and general welfare. The use and value of the area adjacent to the property included in the variance will not be affected substantially in an adverse manner. And then the strict application of terms of the zoning ordinance will result in practical difficulties in the use of the property. This is the only type of variance that you guys can allow under Area Plan Commission. You do not have use variances. I'm going to show you those criteria in a moment. And why I say using this is problematic for a special exception is no matter whether it's solar or not, a special exception, that's not the purpose of the special exception. That's not how we've defined a special exception, that it can only be allowed if there's practical difficulties in the use of that property. So that's really talking about like something that is specific to that parcel of land. It's an awkward shape. It has something running through it that doesn't allow it to be built in a normal way. So we might ask for a variance for the developmental standards, maybe from the backyard setback because there's a creek in the front or something like that. And so that criteria is not helpful when we're thinking about special exceptions because it's not what we're looking at. Use variance, which you do not have the ability to have a use variance under Area Plan Commission, but a lot of times I see these, even if it is an Area Plan Commission, used for their special exceptions. A lot of the same ones, the need for the variance arises from some condition peculiar to the property involved. And the strict application of the terms of the zoning ordinance will constitute an unnecessary hardship if applied to the property for which the variance is sought. Those two just don't work for a special exception. That's not what a special exception is. This is an example from Hendricks County. You guys really have great eyesight here in Decatur County, right? Yeah. And so they use kind of a standard set of criteria for their special exceptions. I'm going to summarize those, so maybe you can read that. But it has to be listed as a special exception. It's pretty good criteria. Like if it's not listed as a special exception in our zoning ordinance for that district, then automatically knocks it out. They use harmonious with the zoning district and general or specific objectives of the comp plan. Remember, there's going to be some that it's not harmonious with in terms of objectives and some that it is almost for every land use. And so that's why it says specific. Designed, oh, I'll get a drink of water. Designed in a way to be harmonious with the general vicinity. So maybe if I was going to put that target out in the middle of a field, I would still have to, and I wanted a special exception for it, I would have to implement it in a way that made it a little bit more harmonious with the area that it was in. Can be served adequately by government services. Will not create excessive additional public costs, will not create detrimental costs, traffic, noise, smoke, fumes, glare, or odors, designed to not create traffic interference, and will not result in the destruction or damage of a feature of major importance. So that's Hendricks County's summarized. I don't even know if they use these same ones. This was the example that's given in the Indiana Citizens Planner Guides. I'm not suggesting that you should use these verbatim by any means, but I think that it's great to look at what other communities are doing, what you're trying to do with your special exceptions, because a BZA is a quasi-judicial board, and so they need that guidance of criteria to be able to make that decision, to be able to put together their findings of fact. Otherwise, that's where we get into issues with BZAs making decisions that are wildly different for approximately the same development. And that's where we can kind of sometimes get into some legal trouble if somebody were to challenge that. The Hendricks County also lists the things that they're going to look at in the special exception hearing. And I think that's really awesome. I think that's a great way to do it. So some of the things that they're going to look at is topography and natural sites, features, zoning of the site and surrounding properties. They're going to look at some things that have to do with traffic. They're going to look at noise, open space. And so this is the same for all their special exceptions. So some of it's not going to apply in some cases, but it gives them an idea of what are the different things that we really need to assess before we make a decision on this. So yeah, I should have warned you, you're going to see this slide 3 times during the presentation. This is, it might be on my tombstone when I die, but this is really what we're trying to consider, right? And so I wanted to kind of take an exercise here. We're close to 7 o'clock and I don't want to keep you too late, but I'll go a little bit longer to do this exercise. We may not go through every single one. But I took, let's see, I printed off your visions and principles from your comprehensive plan, and I copied those visions over. So you guys have vision. This is a pop quiz for your community. How many categories of principles do you have? Anybody? Guess? It's less than 10. Oh, 7, that was a good guess. 5. So there's a vision, or there's one vision for the county, and then you have kind of these different sections: agriculture, future development's required by Indiana code, government, infrastructure and resources, and economic development. Underneath that, you've listed a few like guiding principles for each of those. And so based on that, let's take a look at each of them and what I mean by this like contradictory piece and how we kind of have to weigh that as a community. So, you know, when I go into communities, a lot of times we're already to that point on a development, whether it's a CFO or renewable energy, of yes versus no. But remember, we're always starting, like we've got that balance of private property rights and general welfare. So the conversation should always be more nuanced than that. Instead of yes versus no, let's work through the comp plan. What does this support? What does it not support? So like we're doing community findings of fact as a community. So the principles for agriculture include protecting the county's agricultural resources, balanced preservation of agricultural land while protecting private property rights, focus agricultural related and support businesses along this SR State Road 346 corridor, and continue to support CFO development in the county. That might be the first county I've seen that in. That's interesting. So I still have some PTSD from some of those meetings several years ago. So when we think about protecting the county's agricultural resources are kind of vague. So we might be having a discussion here about, well, solar is taking farmland out of production. So is CRP, but we don't consider that not protecting the natural resources of the community or the agricultural resources. Are the agricultural resources just farmland? And we had to have this conversation a lot when I talked about farmland preservation, or is it the farm businesses? Because those are two different policy, right? If we're protecting farmland, then we're thinking about no concrete, right? Like we're thinking about no ag barns, no, you know, your grain bin. Like if this is an area we're actually wanting to protect, that CFO doesn't belong there because that's concrete, right? If we're thinking more widely about agricultural resources, then we might be thinking more about, then we might say, okay, solar does support farmers that are wanting to diversify. We might say that it doesn't support those ag resources and that it is taking it out of production. So there's some nuance there, right? Same way with down here, balance preservation of ag land while protecting private property rights. Definitely allowing someone to do what they want with their land is protecting private property rights, but we also have this balance of preservation of ag land. You know what this discussion is making me think of? We need to talk about topsoil. Right? So if we're thinking, if one of our objectives or principles is agricultural resource and preservation of ag land, you know, we know with CRP that we sometimes take land out of production, so we're not taking that land out of like inventory, right? So if we're in solar, how are we making sure, if we were to allow solar, how are we making sure that they are protecting topsoil, right? So that might be either a criteria when we're making those decisions as a BZA, or it might be something we're putting in that zoning ordinance. But that's where, as I think about this, that's one of the things that comes up to me is topsoil is important. If farmland preservation is important, we still want them to be able to farm that if they want to in 30 years or once that's gone. Yeah, so you could have something in your ordinance. Oh, I'm so sorry. What would be your criteria to preserve that topsoil? So you could have something in your ordinance about topsoil. We've seen some things, and you can look through the ordinance inventory and see what other communities do. You could also have this as a criteria for special exception, that one of the criteria is that it does the least amount of damage or excavating possible, or something along those lines of preserves as much topsoil as possible during the process. And then that's something that BZA is going to have to look at and say, okay, does this site plan, does this development fit this criteria? How or how not? And that's going to enter into our decision. So I'm not telling you that that's a criteria you should have, but that's the thought process that I want to, in discussion, that I want to encourage you to have as you think about a different land use, right? Any sort of land use. So here's another one. If we're saying that this this solar supports ag businesses or farms and diversification, then maybe this is something that as we were going through a BZA, if it was close to this corridor, that might give it extra points per se in our findings of fact. We might think, oh yeah, this is something that we had in our comp plan. CFO doesn't really have anything to do with it. So here's government. Increase available amenities to limit brain drain of younger generations and the impact of an increasing elderly population. Any thoughts there? Solar support or conflict with that, or neither? What is my opinion about solar? I think that is up for communities to make those decisions. I'm not coming in here to give you a recommendation or to make that decision for you. It is in your plan. But the other thing that happens when we make plans, sure I got the right one here. The other thing that happens when we make plans is you also have as one of your principles that you're going to balance private property rights. So those two things can sometimes conflict, right? Or that we're wanting to provide amenities for older people. If we were to talk to our utility, and I'm not saying that that's the case, but if we were to talk to our local utility and they're telling us, yeah, we're struggling, right? Like we need more generation, then that would be something that could enter into it. So when we're having this discussion, there are going to be things in the comp plan that disagree with each other. And I noticed that, and then I also noticed that this is kind of cool. There's some steering committee minutes in the back of your comp plan. Did anybody know that? It's kind of cool. Kind of interesting. And so one of the things that I thought was really interesting was they changed, where was this? Maybe I didn't print that exact one. They had changed it to they had changed their stance on utility scale renewable energy from the word discourage to not support. And I thought that was interesting because I didn't necessarily take not support as neutral, but that feels, once I read that steering committee, I'm like, oh, that feels like it was meant to be more neutral. And so how do we implement that in a zoning ordinance? And I thought, the zoning ordinance is actually relatively consistent with that, right? Because the zoning ordinance is not super restrictive. It's not discouraging. It's there, but it's also not super supportive either. Like it's kind of balanced, right? And so I thought, oh, that's really interesting. I wonder if somebody made that connection when moving from those steering committee minutes to the zoning ordinance. If it is, it's kind of cool that you had that discussion. But no, there are going to be things that conflict in your comprehensive plan. You can pull out. It's a lot like the Bible, right? You can pull out one passage and make it sound exactly how I want it to sound, or you want it to sound, or whatever it might be. What we have to do is look at the whole and have a balanced conversation around those decisions. Does that help? So as we go through here, support individual on-site non-commercial alternative energy sources. That does not support utility scale. It doesn't conflict with it, but it also doesn't support it. And so those are some of the things that we want to think about. We've got preserve natural resources as we move into infrastructure and resources. That might lead us to a discussion about wildlife corridors, or it might lead us to a discussion about what ground cover, like we're requiring ground cover, but it doesn't specify a lot about that. And so maybe when we go into that, maybe one of our criteria is how does this development support natural resource preservation? And so you're not setting a specific criteria. It's a little bit more like that scorecard, but that's your criteria for the BZA to make their decision. Protect groundwater quality, the municipal airport, doesn't really matter. So as I get back to this. There's a whole, like it's a 165-page report, right? And so there are things in there that are more specific, like specifically not taking farmland. And so looking at if that's a policy recommendation, did it make it into the zoning ordinance? Because we do have to follow what's in the zoning ordinance, and the zoning ordinance should have been created with that comp plan in mind. But there are going to be contradictions within that, and we've got to have that discussion about how we make those decisions as a community. So you just listened to me for an hour and 10 minutes to tell you, you really have to talk about it. There is no set answer, right? Let me share a little bit about our step before I take more questions if you have any. The first thing is some things that we have coming up. So we've got a webinar series for local decision makers. We're holding regional workshops. I don't know that there's any that are well, there is one in Randolph County in June, which is relatively close by. Right now, we're coupling those regional workshops with bus tours in the afternoon, so people get to go out and see facilities. We'll set up to where we've got different setbacks, and you can look and see, okay, visually, what does a 1,000-foot setback look like? What does a 500-foot setback like, and so forth. Most of those are looking at wind and solar. We do, as we get into the southern part, some of those will be solar only. Right now, we're working on a needs assessment. Ball State is conducting a study of the regulatory environment and what effect regulations on renewable energy has on the county GDP and employment. I'm beginning the ordinance inventory. We're also working on a GIS tool. And then we'll also soon have a webinar series for landowners and some networking events too. To stay connected, this is a 3-year grant, so that's just the next 6 months. We've got a lot of things planned for the next years, and that needs assessment will really drive a lot of that. So if you see the needs assessment, take it, because that helps us to decide what we need to do. This is our website up here, our step, and on that you'll notice this became live in December. We're starting to populate it. We do have several resources. So one of the things that we've been doing is trying to compile resources on topics that people are asking questions about, because I am not an electrical engineer. I am not a lot of different things, but I can read research and I can search for information in some of those things. And so we do have a nice resource page on there, and it's growing weekly. We're trying to add things. It'll also be, if you subscribe to our Purdue Extension Community Development newsletter, there will be announcements about any of those bus tours or regional workshops, and you can do that on the website, or you're welcome to reach out to myself or any of my colleagues with questions or additional resources. Those are the 3 of us that are on the grant for Purdue. So if you need email addresses, they're there. Kara and I are co-PIs or principal investigators for the grant. Kayla, we hired to help us with this grant and another grant. So, and then in true extension fashion, as we're in the midst of a legislative session and a budget, if you don't mind taking the evaluation, I would appreciate it. You can scan that with a QR code, and it's like 3 or 4 questions. It is voluntary and anonymous, but greatly appreciated as we report back to funders locally, county, and federally. Locally, state, and federally. Any questions?
One slide you said that the Indiana code really doesn't have any specific criteria.
Oh, hold on a second. Can you take the mic?
Oh, sorry. I said in the one slide you said that the Indiana code didn't really specify criteria. But is there any way that how can we change our ordinances to be aligned with the state guidance?
Yeah, so you can. I didn't talk about the state guidance. The state does have voluntary standards. You could amend your standards to match the state standards. I don't know that I would super recommend that. I mean, I don't, like, that's up to you, but sometimes some of those state voluntary standards don't necessarily jive with with the language and what you use in your own ordinance. And that goes back to this, like, every county has a different ordinance and they use different terminology and they use different ways of measuring setbacks and so forth. And so I think the state did a really great job of thinking about what do a lot of counties use, but that may not be, that language and those in that setbacks and so forth may not fit with what your county uses. And so anytime, this is where we go back to our attorney, which we love to have our attorney when we're doing anything with ordinance amendment, is to say, okay, maybe there's a provision in the state that we're really interested in, or maybe we're interested in general. How does that fit into our ordinance? Does that jive with what we already have?
So I'm going to go back to one of the slides that you had at the very beginning where you were talking about energy usage.
Uh-huh.
It's the one with the Purdue study right there. So that's a pretty big gap.
Yeah.
So my question is there a plan to fill that gap? And what happens if we don't fill that gap? Are they going to, like, turn off electricity to certain communities, or are we just going to, like, say, sorry, yeah.
Do
Are
we
they
have
gonna
anybody from a
regulate it, or
utility
keep-
here or an REMC?
No, but I'm familiar with it. So they'll do exactly what California is doing.
Yeah.
So in California, if you build a new home, put some renewable energy on it, offset that demand. And in sections of California, for example, where there's the most power, they will turn on and off your power a certain days. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's exactly what will happen.
Yeah, brownouts and blackouts. So what, and I hear different, like, I talk to a lot of utilities, I talk to a lot of REMCs, and I hear similar but slightly different messages from each, and it depends on where you're at, like what the capacity is on your transmission lines, whether or not you're being fed by a coal plant that's getting ready to shut down and so forth, or if you have other things that are coming online, all of those different things. But yeah, there is a possibility of brownouts and blackouts. If we don't have the electricity and the states to the west of us are not producing enough of a surplus that we can import that electricity in, that's where we would have scheduled shutoffs, and it would rotate. And they probably would do things for, institutional uses like hospitals and schools and so forth, would have priority and so forth. The other thing that you're probably going to see, and maybe I'm live streaming, so maybe I shouldn't say this, but there's going to be things that we retire or that we were planning on retiring that we don't retire because we were not expecting the demand of electricity to rise in the way that it has, especially where you've got a data center close by. There's also going to be things where you see a lot more, small production with, you might require that with a new industry, so instead of, I don't know, yeah, so that might be part of it. We're going to start tiffing energy, probably not, but yeah, it's a big gap.
One more question on your next slide that
Mm-hmm.
you had. The the solar cost, if I'm looking at that right, is
Popped up.
lower than pretty much everything that's out there, correct?
Onshore wind is actually the lowest right now. They were very similar. Solar jumped up kind of with some supply issues after the pandemic, or during and after the pandemic, as a lot of things did. And but yeah, these are both pretty similar, and a lot of that is one, technology, and like I said, nobody's paying for that fuel. So if you own a coal generation plant, you have to pay for that coal. You also have a lot more labor than you do with with solar and wind. And so that's what's driving that lower cost.
Kind of additional question. So electricity is regulated, the cost that they charge to the user is regulated, which would be based on the cost that they have to pay. So embracing lower cost energy would potentially bring lower cost to the individual consumer, potentially.
Yes, in theory, yeah. Yes.
Economically, we would be better off embracing the cheapest, no matter whether we get a big benefit. Well, I mean, there's.
Yes, I mean, I don't know that our only energy policy should be cheapest, like with anything. So we also, I mean, it's what we're going to see moving forward is a combination of many of these things. And that's important because you do have peak hours, like you do have, you do need a base load for when the sun's not shining and so forth. We're also going to see more battery storage to help with that. But it really takes a mix and a diversification of different energy types to create a more reliable system. And so, yes, affordability is one thing. I think reliability is also really important. And then we also have to think about where fuel's coming from and tariffs and whether that's a adverse location, right? And that's one of the issues that we run into, or an adverse country. Is that the right term for an adversary? So that's one of the issues we run into with nuclear, right? Is our fuel, that fuel, the majority of it would be coming from Russia.
So does Purdue have anything that looks at the attributes that go into the community afterwards as far as from a financial perspective, or are you just simply looking at this from a zoning issue? Fine, you're doing great.
Well, thank you. A little bit of both. So I do have a student that's working on compiling economic development agreements, and her honors thesis is going to be inventorying those, much like I did the ordinance inventory. We also will have some fact sheets, and we touch on it in a lot of the workshops about community benefit agreements, economic development agreements. I think it's a really important aspect. I was slated to help my own community facilitate a community benefit agreement. So the developer was like, oh yeah, we're willing to make this a more community approach to looking at the economic development agreement and what they really want. And unfortunately, because our zoning ordinance was such a mess, like we weren't operating legally anyway at that point in time. And so then they had to go through the ordinance change, and then there was just a lot of drama and misunderstandings about land use. You're not an expert in your own community is the moral of the story. But yeah, I didn't get a chance to do that. But I think that, you know, one of the things that we do have written into year 2 and 3 is facilitating some of those community processes. We're not making the decisions for you, but helping communities think through either a zoning ordinance update, a comp plan update, energy planning in general. Like maybe we just want to sit down with utilities and that serve our area and really talk about how much of a risk is this gap specific to our area, or community benefits agreements and what does our community want to see. This is a lot of money that comes in from an assessed value standpoint, but also in that economic development payment. And it can go into the general fund coffers at the county and sit there, or it can go to places where the community wants to see it go. Neither of those things are wrong, but they're different approaches. And so I think it would be really exciting as a community to come together. Like, how often do you get that much money and it's like, okay, what do you want to spend this on? Like, what do we really want to see?
I mean, you brought up the point, the BZA in our community, it's 5, but in all the other counties across the state, to me, they're in a bubble. Nobody can talk to them, and they're being asked to do a huge amount of information research on this.
Yeah.
Can you explain how they can reach out for help correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we had this conversation with Tim early on. Going through something like American Citizen Planner, you're going to sit in those meetings and talk about ethics and future land use, or some of the meetings that we have in person or on Zoom, like live meetings, with a bunch of other Plan Commission members from other counties. You get to know each other. The other thing is, we mentioned you really need to be a member, your staff needs to be a member of APA Indiana. I go to conferences every spring and fall for APA. I learn about what's coming up. I know, like, when I forget something or I'm not sure how something works, a lot of times I call another plan or a plan director in one of the counties that I know well, and I say, okay, walk me through this. What am I not seeing here? And so I think that there's a lot of cross-pollination between executive directors when they're members of APA, and that's really important. That's also one of the reasons why we did that inventory with the county snap sheets. It's got the number of all those offices in it. And so when you see a snap sheet that I have a question about how this ordinance works, you can reach out and call that office. And usually planners love to talk about planning. Could you tell that today? I'm not even a certified planner, and I like to talk about planning. So so planners really are pretty good about helping each other. We do run into this issue, and this is one of the things we wanted to focus on in this grant. In a lot of rural or smaller counties, we do not either pay enough or have the pool to hire a certified planner. And there's not necessarily something wrong with that, but when you are a certified planner, you're going to conferences to get your continuing education. You've been through the American, the planner test. You've either gone to school to be a planner, or you've been in that industry for long enough to have gotten your certification. And so we also are losing land use attorneys, like people that specialize in land use, right? So that county attorney may or may not have a lot of experience in land use. And so with that, in rural and smaller communities, we're seeing that like lack of expertise in planning, and that really leaves our citizen members floundering. Like, what do we do? And oftentimes they're looking to staff. And so anytime that we can provide services, especially in those counties, we can provide workshops, we can connect the plan director with somebody that is certified that's in another county. We try to do that because it's really hard. Greg, is it hard? Doug, is it hard to come?
You're 2 out of 3.
Doug, is it hard to come into this job? Does it feel like drinking out of a fire hose?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, there's a lot on the table right now, but back to your point about the planners, like today, we've got some issues. And I called surrounding counties, the area plan directors, and they were more than happy to discuss my issues, what they do,
Yeah.
and how they can help, or hey, just come down and follow me, show you how we do it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of truth.
Yeah. If you're willing to learn, it's a great job for you. If you like learning, it's a great job for you.
I think you zeroed in, like in our comp plan, when you said it kind of comes down to the soil and that. In some other ordinances and perhaps comp plans, I've read where there's, constant soil testing throughout the life of the project. There's agrivoltaics is, encouraged, if not, required. What are some other things that you've been in contact with or heard of to kind of help that be addressed in local ordinances?
So a couple of things here, and I should have mentioned this at the beginning. We regulate for the community. We don't regulate for those individual landowners. So those individual landowners are also signing a lease, and some of those things and some of those requirements may be in those individual leases that they're signing with the solar developer. And so I think it is great to talk as a community about what belongs in an individual lease and what doesn't. How do we get education to landowners about how to go about these leases, and developers for the most part aren't skeevy, right? Like it is a business. They are trying to make money, but this is a long-term relationship. And so there is a lot of conversations. Anybody a landowner here that's willing to say that? No, okay, that's fine. That's fine. That was a hard question. There's a lot of conversation that happens, but anytime anybody's entering a lease, we want them to have that education to be able to feel informed about that lease, to be able to ask for the things that they really are important to them and they want to ask about, to feel protected. So I think that that's one piece. Also, I would say our Purdue on-farm has at least considered, I haven't talked to them lately because we've had some personnel changeover, but was looking at doing some soil testing, and sometimes developers will enter into relationships with universities to do some research on that property. So I think that's another great thing for communities and landowners is, if that's something that the developer's already looking into or interested in doing and the university is also interested, I think that that's a great thing to do. So the other part of that you asked about, so agrivoltaics. One of the issues with agrivoltaics is what kind of agriculture would you like to put with these panels? Yeah, sure.
Okay. Sheep grazing?
Okay.
Or
how many of you have eaten lamb in the last week? Have you eaten lamb in the last week? No. Okay. Yeah. So one of the issues that we run into agrivoltaics is the scale of it, right? We definitely have some things going on. Dunsbridge, I think there's a project at Mammoth too with sheep grazing. There's even some hog grazing. They're like a specific type of hogs. And we'll have a bus tour actually at the Dunsbridge place. But we don't have, like if you have raised cattle or sheep or swine on your own and taken it to a small butcher, you might know the difficulty, or maybe it's not that difficult down here, but up where I'm at, it is very difficult to get a date. Sometimes you do that as soon as the animal's born, right? And so we have this issue if we're going to eat or if we're going to graze a lot of sheep or goats, we've got to also have the processors to be able to handle that, and we also have to have a market for it. Like y'all need to start eating some lamb roast, right? But I say that my parents raised sheep, and I do love lamb. My husband does not. It's a little bit of a fight. But yeah, so then when we're looking at something, other crops, in Indiana we grow a lot of corn and beans. So there's things like blueberries. We can sometimes space panels out and grow some things in between, but we're not actually we don't have a lot of people that are doing that without the solar panels, and so that becomes hard to implement on a large scale. And when we look at some of the crops that we do raise, corn and soybeans, that's what we're good at here in Indiana, aside from hogs. But we run into, okay, now you got to raise those panels up really high, and so that creates more of a conflict with landowners, right? Visual impact. This is where it's so much fun to think about, right? All these different things interact with each other. Or we're spacing things out to the point where at some point in time it could be not profitable enough for that developer to go forward with the project. We need it to be profitable for them if they're going to move forward with it, right? Because that's how business works. But at the same time, we also want to think about that balance, right? The developer's doing this as a business. The landowner's doing this in receiving payment for his land. And then as a community, there's also this opportunity for community benefits. And are we making sure that we're also pulling those funds in and it's not just a private exchange if there are some externalities that we need to address? Sorry, that was a really exciting question for me. So to come back, agrivoltaics is one. I think encouraged is great, but I do think that you need to think about, do you have, and you don't here, but do you have a minimum distance from the ground or a maximum distance from the ground? Because that's going to impact the ability to do agrivoltaics. Do you have a maximum height? That might impact it. So you got to make sure if you want to encourage agrivoltaics that your ordinance standards don't conflict with it. The other thing that we see a lot of is ground cover. So do you want so much of it to be native or pollinator friendly? Those are both things that, native is going to go deeper roots. I'm told that's better for soil health. I'm not a soil health scientist, but that's another thing to consider. And you could do that as the whole property, but you could also do it as certain sections, right?
Another concern was, and I think we addressed it in ours, is the drainage tiles and
Yeah.
such, because that does have a direct effect on other. such.
Yes, yeah.
How has that been addressed in some others? Again, I think we do, but
Yeah, and it's pretty much addressed the same way. So that private landowner should have something in there about drainage for his own private tiles in his lease, his or her lease. And then really anything that's going to be over an acre is going to have to go through an MPDES permit or whatnot. So you're going to go through drainage. You do have a construction bond, I think, in yours, which is going to, if there is damage, well, so one thing is, I think your ordinance says that if there's any damage, they have to leave it the same or better than they found it, right? They have to fix anything. But the other thing is sometimes that construction bond, if something were to happen, could be drawn upon to fix drainage tile.
Can I go back to the last map? Or I'm sorry, the last graph, the one that showed the energy deficit
Yeah.
by season. So I just want to make sure that I'm understanding the deficit. Is this showing the deficit over the entire summer period, or is it a daily deficit? Because if it's the entire summer season, meaning like months,
Yeah.
that's one deficit versus a daily deficit, which is much, much
Yeah. I'll have to look back. So this comes from the 2003 or 23 forecast from the State Utility Forecast Group. So I'll have to look back and see, but I'm pretty sure that this is over the summer season. But I don't see it on that scale there. So yeah, I'm pretty sure it's summer season, but I'll have to look back, and you're welcome to look back too. So always try to cite my sources so you guys can look. You can only put so much on a slide. Okay, it is, well, it's not quite past my bedtime, but I was gonna say, if we get silent too long, it'll just be, I did see a hotel in the room on the way in, so, or a hotel. If you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out. Happy to have conversations.